Welcome back to another episode of the Caffeinated Christian Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Pastor Mike Wigglesworth. To my right is Bradley, the man with no last name, and coming in from Zoom is Dr. Ryan Willert. How y'all doing today, guys?
Oh, pretty good.
I'm doing good.
All right. Ryan, how's Ohio life treating you?
It's actually pouring rain right now, so I don't know.
Oh, sorry. You should be here.
To the new move or whatnot, but so far I still have 100 boxes to unpack and trying to get my audio and everything set up. So.
All right. Yeah. In case you guys didn't know, Ryan did relocate to Ohio for a job, and we do have a special guest who's going to be joining us today online. But before we introduce him, let's talk about the coffee we're drinking today.
Is it like have a name or something?
No.
Okay.
No, it does not have a name.
I thought you were just going to skip this.
This is our church coffee. Whatever coffee we happen to use at Centerpointe Community Church on Sunday morning, this is what we're currently drinking. It's not half bad. It is literally the pot of coffee that was here that was made for the previous meeting I was on before jumping onto this podcast. If you want to get more information on it, I don't know how to help you.
You can come visit us on a Sunday.
You can come visit us on a Sunday and experience the coffee for yourself. All right.
Experience 4-hour-old coffee.
Yes. So today we have a great topic and we have a great guest joining us today. Today we're talking about non-toxic masculinity. I'm sure you've all heard this term. It's one of those cultural buzzwords that's thrown around kind of, carelessly. Toxic masculinity. It's used to describe all sorts of things. Well, our guest today is Pastor Zachary Wagner. He's from the States, but he's doing PhD work in England. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
All right. And Zachary Wagner is a writer, researcher, ordained minister, thinker of thoughts, and feeler of feelings. Originally from the Chicagoland area, he now lives in Oxford, England, where he's pursuing his DPhil, which is PhD, in New Testament studies at Keble College, University of Oxford. He also serves as editorial director of the Center for Pastor Theologians, where he co-hosts the CPT podcast. And there's all sorts of interests that Pastor Zach has that I won't list off here today, but we would like to introduce him and welcome to the Caffeinated Christian Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right. So Zach, you wrote extensively on this topic of how sex and sexuality has been presented and modeled to the church, and which is kind of the inspiration of your book. So could you tell us what drove you to write about this topic in particular? And with that, can you give us a 30,000-foot view of the book, Non-Toxic Masculinity?
Sure, yeah. So two kind of streams that led to the writing of the book. One is the kind of cultural narrative movement, however you want to describe it, particularly starting with Me Too in 2016 and then Church Too, which highlighted the problem of sexual abuse and sexual violence in Christian spaces in particular, and then just kind of abuse scandal after abuse scandal, these things coming down the pipe, and perhaps one of the most notorious of which is Ravi Zacharias, but another one people are talking about a lot is Josh Duggar with the Shiny Happy People documentary that just dropped on Amazon. That was also kind of in the news when I was thinking about starting to write this book. So there's kind of all of that there seemed to me to be something off, something wrong in the church as it relates to sexuality, and these kind of broader cultural issues were not, the church was by no means protected from them, and these were reproducing themselves in the church, and in some ways even worse and more nefarious, it seems to me, in the church space. I don't have stats on prevalence of sexual violence or anything like that in the church relative to culture, but certainly in a community that presents itself as prizing sexual purity, quote unquote, you would think that this would happen less.
Right.
But sadly, that doesn't always seem to be the case. So that's the kind of cultural narrative. And then the other side of it is my personal story, which is that I grew up in a Christian home. I was homeschooled through my 8th grade year. grew up in conservative, overwhelmingly white, evangelical spaces. And like many of my generation, was very formed by what many today call purity culture, which is these kind of systems of rhetoric, influential books, and things like that, that shaped me and the way that I thought about my sexuality, and as well as shaped my expectations for what marriage would be like. And long story short, I do go into it in some detail in the book, and I'm happy to talk about it more. But for the purposes of kind of getting to the meat of the conversation, my wife Shelby and I, despite by the book kind of quote unquote following the rules of sexual purity as it was presented to us when we were young, we got married and found that contrary to the kind of expectation or promise, even sometimes, that was given in the church, where if you quote unquote save yourself until marriage, you'll have this free and happy and joyful and easy connection in marriage, which I don't know, anyone who's been married for longer than 10 minutes knows that that's just not quite right. But for us especially, we found that pretty much immediately we were struggling mightily in various ways. And so kind of, it was a bit of, not everybody loves the term, but it was a bit of a deconstruction project for me, in the sense of working through the kind of sexual discipleship that I was brought up into in the church, and then also looking at this kind of broader issue of scandals that I was seeing. So cultural and personal. Right.
No, good. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying.
So, if I may ask a question, I know Pastor Mike brought this up for this, especially.
I think
pretty loaded with culturally with different definitions and assumptions that may or may not be true. I'm assuming a lot of it are very close to truth to make it more deceptive than not. So my question is, how do you define this concept of toxic masculinity, and how have you also seen it defined incorrectly?
Sure. I think a couple ways that, I don't know what, it's a contested term, so I'm not sure if there's one correct definition or not. But one thing, a definition that I'll say is unhelpful, is the insinuation that it is problematic or in some sense just bad from go to be male, or that any association that we might have with masculinity just because it's that is bad and evil. That is, I think, profoundly unhelpful, and it's not often used that way, but I think some people genuinely, a few people I should say, perhaps genuinely just have animus or, I don't know if you'd call it prejudice just against men. And that's perhaps understandable given the, bad and sinful and wicked things that men can kind of manifest as a pattern of male behavior. But I don't think condemning maleness broadly is all that helpful.
Right.
But the way I try to define it, and the way I articulate it in the book, is really focusing in on that term toxic. What does toxic mean? We think of toxic, you think of something poisonous, something that leads to ill health, something that is destructive, or something like that. So I then define toxic masculinity as a way of expressing maleness or male embodiment, you might say, that dehumanizes others or dehumanizes self. So it is a dehumanizing way of living out your maleness is the way I want to define it. So then a non-toxic or a positive or rehumanized masculinity would be ways of living out our maleness as men that make us more human, not less human, and dignify others as fully human, not as objects, not as less human than us, perhaps. but honors them as creatures created in the image of God.
Sorry, to follow up on that, I'm assuming quickly. Sorry, Bradley, I didn't mean to interrupt
go ahead.
there.
Keep in mind we've got limited time.
Oh yeah, sorry. There is then a toxic femininity according to your definition. Then.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never thought about that. Perhaps not in the same way. Something I talk about in the book is that I think there is a unique, given what I describe as male embodied advantage, which is just maybe a wordy way of describing the fact that men in general are physically larger and stronger than women. I think there is, when men get bent in this way, where they dehumanize themselves or dehumanize others, I do think it's fair to say that they can cause more damage more quickly,
right?
Than women who are malformed to dehumanize others. I've never thought of that question. That's a good question, but I'd have some hesitations of saying there's like a toxic femininity that is the mirror image to toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good.
And I was going to ask, what are some ways that men can dehumanize others? And also, what do you think separates like something that somebody may perceive as toxic from just like juvenile behavior?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the large focus of my book is on the sexuality question. So I think a very kind of standard way that men dehumanize others is by reducing others to their sexuality or to their bodies or to something like that. So this is when men speak about or think about or treat women as less human or as less as objects, sexual objects, including your wife, I should say. Like, this is not just something that's limited to, people you are not married to, I suppose. Like, it is entirely possible to dehumanize and treat your wife as less human than you or even as a sexual object. So that's just a really common example of that. But there's also ways that I think men can leverage their, again, embodied kind of advantage as being physically stronger than women to selfish ends. And I think that is dehumanizing to the people around them. And it's dehumanizing to themselves because when you kind of bend the created goodness of your humanity back towards yourself, you're actually ironically becoming less human. And then to get to your second part of your question about immaturity, there is a natural kind of growing up process that all children and young people go through, where and part of this is learning to treat others with respect. So in that sense, when a toddler throws a temper tantrum, is that immature? Yes. Is it toxic? No, I don't think that's quite right, because I think the life stage would imply that there is time and expectation and, hope that that toddler will grow out of that temper tantrum stage. But if you're, a boss in a work environment and you're throwing the adult equivalent of temper tantrums when something doesn't go your way, or you don't get your way, and you're, the 3-year-old hits his sister, and the terrible boss in the toxic work environment chews out and cusses out his employees. That's, I think, the distinction. That latter thing is perhaps I would describe as toxic, whereas the former thing is an immaturity.
Could I just ask just a real quick follow-up to that?
Sure.
At what age do you think like the juvenile behavior like kind of meets its limit and becomes toxic? Because like, I mean, as a teenager, I was an absolute menace. I mean, Ryan can tell you. But like, I mean, at that point, it's like I'm still learning.
It's a great question, and I don't know if there's like a cutoff or a statute of limitations or something like that. But it is. I mean, you look at someone you think about the age of 25, and you think about the age of 15 and then 5, and there are just, I think, culturally assumed expectations of behavior associated with those things. But we also don't want to just kind of drop it to the lowest common denominator of like what culture thinks is acceptable behavior.
Right.
And this can get tricky when we're talking about, again, I'm just trying to raise questions. Is it a sin for the toddler to throw the temper tantrum? In a certain sense, yes. But I think we also allow for all kinds of grace for toddlers being toddlers, immature humans being immature. And I think there ought to be a continued progression up. And I think this is honestly the narrative of creation in Scripture. Like, humanity wasn't just created in an Edenic state and then said, okay, great, let's just kind of keep this the way it is. I actually see in Scripture a narrative where humanity was created and called to mature and grow up and move into the world and flourish. Mm-hmm. And the Christ event actually restores us onto that path. It's not just about restoring perfection. It's actually about getting us back on the path to become what we were meant to be all along.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's just kind of me saying some of the same stuff more. I would say there's not like a specific time where it crosses over from like, this is immaturity and now this is sin and therefore it's toxic. It's actually much more fluid than that. And even I think we would say, the toddler throwing a tantrum and hitting his sister is sin in a very real sense, but it's different than the adult situation, and culpability increases as maturity ought to as well, I would say.
Now, I had an opportunity to read through your book. I thought it was a great read, insightful, and I grew up in my middle school and high school years, maybe a few years ahead of you, but not by many. So your experience is largely similar to my experience, and some people looking on the outside looking in to the evangelical church, they would say that this whole thing is inherently patriarchal and misogynistic by default. And we see, like you mentioned, that Christian leaders are oftentimes at the center of abuse scandals, right? And so Christians will often protect abusers rather than the abused. And it seems like in your book, you'd say one of the culprits is what you refer to as purity culture. So I know you referenced it before, but if you could just give us a definition of how would you describe purity culture for those viewers or listeners rather who might not be familiar?
Yeah, so I define it as a kind of I define it as a subcultural movement in response to a broader cultural movement, i.e. the sexual revolution. So 60s and 70s really is birth control, all of these sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And it is also, I think, very fair to say that in the decades following that, there was a lot of, not to say it was all negative, but there were some negative consequences of that, including rise in out-of-wedlock births and abortion rates going up and STDs and all of these sorts of things that are genuine instances of human suffering. So Christians, in response to just the overturning of prevailing sexual mores, but I think also in response to genuine suffering that they saw in the world and wanted to protect their communities from, and certainly their kids from, just launched a certain type of movement that is associated with youth conferences and books and ways of talking about sexuality and saving yourself for marriage, quote unquote, all of this stuff. There are a few really popular books at the center of it. Joshua Harris's I Kissed Dating Goodbye is the one that comes to people's minds most often. I think for men in particular, Every Man's Battle by Fred Soiker and Stephen Arterburn is perhaps even more influential. And there's also, you can think about Elizabeth Elliot, Passion and Purity, and, you can just rattle them off. Mm-hmm. But what's it characterized by? How would you describe it? I think there's an emphasis on abstinence, premarital abstinence, particularly for young people and teens, as well as this sense that if you hold off on sex now, it will pay dividends for your sex life in the future in your marriage. Right. So God asks for obedience now so that he can bless you in the future.
It's like a sexual prosperity gospel, you described it?
Precisely,
Yeah.
yeah. I describe it that way in the book. And that's not original to me, but Caitlin Beatty, who is an author and an editor, I believe she works at Brazos now, if I'm not mistaken. She wrote an article to that effect that I thought was very insightful a few years ago that I cite in my book. So yeah, this kind of premarital abstinence for teens, sexual fulfillment in marriage. And I think you can also add an emphasis on traditional gender roles, leadership for men, submission, and kind of domestic parenting life for women, as well as an emphasis on heterosexuality as a Christian norm over and against the homosexuality, which was becoming more and more kind of prevalent and accepted in the culture. Right. That's kind of in brief how I would describe it. But it became very much a thing. There's tons of books that have been written about it now, both from a kind of theological discipleship angle, as well as historians and scholars that are analyzing this thing. Yeah. So for listeners who grew up outside of it, I don't know what to say other than it was very much a thing for people who grew up in the church in this era. Last thing I'll say is it became a pronounced emphasis of youth discipleship, almost to the exclusion of so many other things. Right. It just became an outsized focus of, the essence of what it means to be a good Christian teen is that you're not sleeping with your boyfriend or your girlfriend.
Like, if the unforgivable sin was anything, it was sleeping with your significant other outside of marriage.
Yes. Nothing worse that you can imagine.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I like Mike. We're roughly the same age, so I experienced that too during youth culture, where it was, as you said in the book, the great sex, quote unquote, prosperity gospel, where they're just like, this is the be all end all to your sort of belief system in religion, and if you can accomplish this goal, you've reached the height of your Christianity, which is very interesting. So they're like, just say no, just do this. But one of the things that I think the church has failed in is, first of all, the church's maturity in dealing with the subject. But one of the things they haven't done well is training and creating habits in disciples to create a spiritually mature Christian. And my experience, and I'm sure this is everyone's experience, it seems that this sort of category of masculinity stems off from more root of a problem, like a heart condition, right? Like a lack of maturity spiritually. So how should the church disciple men better when it comes to spiritual maturity in this topic?
Yeah, I think, again, it should be said that so much of purity culture was well intentioned, trying to help, trying to have men and women experience freedom and joy in their lives as it relates to their sexuality and certainly in their marriages. But I think one way we really got sideways as it relates to men is that we kind of adopted and baptized this hypersexualized view of men, where men are just these kind of erotic animals, and we can't help but have this sexual lens that we view every situation through, every person, every body that comes into our view is just all through this sexual lens. And sadly, rather than saying that is a dehumanizing and sub-Christian vision of masculinity that we find in the culture, that Christians need to reject even that way of defining masculinity. Instead, we kind of adopted it and said, one, create barriers around that kind of out of control masculine sexual desire, number one. Number two, get a man to marriage kind of intact, and then he can, as it were, release his animalistic sexual urges in this beautiful way. But we never discipled the man to discipline that sexuality in a way that would actually honor and respect and dignify his partner in marriage.
Right.
So I think it actually, sadly, and this isn't always the case, but sadly often set up expectations in marriage to be very slanted towards a man's needs, a man's gratification, and in ways that are often just profoundly damaging and even traumatizing to women. So what's the better way to disciple men? I think look to the examples in Scripture, number one, of men who didn't define themselves. It would be difficult to actually find someone in Scripture as positively defined as kind of like a virile sexual man. Jesus and the Apostle Paul were single and celibate and are the two most, revered figures at the founding of Christianity. So that should give us pause. If we're thinking about like a Christian vision of masculinity is this kind of get men to a sexually fulfilling marriage. And then we look at Christianity's founding and we see Jesus and the Apostle Paul saying nothing of the sort. That's problematic, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And another thing I'll say, this is getting a little bit off of the question, but it's coming to mind, is that it hasn't always been the case that masculinity has been defined in terms of out of control sexual desire. Ironically, perhaps to many people today, in the ancient world, it would have been femininity that would have been more closely associated with like a kind of lusty energy of being in the world. Again, that's just kind of like, it might make us confused to think about that. But given the influence of kind of philosophical things like Stoicism that actually put a lot of emphasis on self-control, and to be manly was to kind of have your passions governed and not need to indulge in the kind of bodily pleasures that were available. That's not everyone in the ancient world thought that way, but it was definitely something that was in the air. And it was, in fact, it was an insult that people in the ancient world would leverage against others, would say, like, if you're indulging in your bodily passions, you're acting in a womanish way, which is it just shows how culturally situated even these ideas are. So yeah, sorry to get back to the original question. I'd just say that creating structures that actually encourage men to grow in the fruits of the Spirit, including self-control, rather than just create external boundaries around their behavior and be transformed internally in their vision of what it means to be male, would be a great start and would be more life-giving, it seems to me, than a lot of what we may have got around these issues when we were younger.
Yeah, and to go with that as well, just like the animalistic sexual urges that men have, that our culture sees as like the only thing that, they can attribute to masculinity. There's like a stereotype that often goes along with that, which is like, men are only in it for the feeling and they're not so much in it for the emotional aspect. And, as men, we're typically less emotional than women are.
Sure.
But, I think that a lot of men have a hard time articulating that, they want an emotional connection as well as the physical connection. So
Sure.
what's, one way that we could probably change that stereotype and change the thinking of not just the church, but like men in general, that, it's not just about the feeling or the physical aspect, it's about the emotional aspect as well.
Yeah, well, one is just stop making fun of men for having feelings, or quit socializing them out of that at a young age. I have an anecdote where I talk about there's no crying in baseball.
Rub some dirt on it.
Yeah, exactly. Rub some dirt on it, tough it out. Real men don't cry, sort of thing. And again, just looking at Scripture, David was a super kind of weepy, emotional guy. And, Jesus wept. And Paul, I don't think you could describe it. Like, Paul is very animated about his emotions and wears his heart on his sleeve oftentimes. So that just doesn't line up with the models we see in Scripture, first of all. And again, I would just say I'm not qualified to speak on the biology or even the sociology for that matter. But I was going to say that I think we assume that so much of this is just innate and in the kind of bloodstream of what it means to be a man, that this means that we're kind of like stoic and emotionally repressed. But all throughout history and even today, we have many models of masculinity that do not kind of demonstrate that. And then to get to the question of the sex itself, I think there's, again, a stereotype that men are just kind of like animals and sex is just kind of like an instinct with no emotional resonance for men. But that's, again, just not true. I don't think men, as you said, are always good at articulating it. But let's just say if you have a compulsive, like, pornography habit where this isn't just because I'm a dude, I like sexual kind of gratification or stimulation or something like that. So I go and look at this visual stimulus that is just kind of doing just a purely bodily thing to me, and then I experience this physical pleasure, and that's just body. There's no emotions there. Absolutely not. There's emotions going on all up and down that compulsive behavior. And if you were to interrogate yourself and think through your story and the times when you have the urge to indulge in pornography or even like seek out a physical encounter with somebody in the world or whatever the case may be, there's something emotional going on there. There's probably a wound, there's a pain. And I think even in marriage and, kind of long-term sexual relationships, men, perhaps with the help of a therapist or a trusted friend or just even open conversation with your spouse, you'd find that there's something emotional that sex does for you. It's soothing you in some way. And that doesn't mean that's bad necessarily. I'm just highlighting that it's not unemotional. And understanding those emotions that are behind these sexual urges that we experience, whether that's desire to feel accepted or safe or soothed or desired yourself or delighted in yourself or received or, any number of things. I think on just a little bit of closer examination, the stereotype that there's nothing emotional going on for men in sex doesn't hold up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really good. And I could say from experience, I am not an emotionally detached male. I'm very emotional, but like a lot of men, that's something that's emotional. It's repressed. I've even had conversations with my wife where I'm like, hey, you know what? I'm not terribly good at expressing my feelings, and so I'm in counseling to kind of work that out,
Mm-hmm.
But another aspect of sex that's really been emphasized in our culture is consent. Now, of course, consent is critical, but it's reductionistic of us to think that consent is the only thing that matters, not only when it comes to sexuality, but when it comes to human flourishing in general. There's lots of things that you can consent to that are just unhealthy. And you mentioned in your book that, both people can consent to something that's one-sided. And that doesn't lead to relational health necessarily with a married couple. And I just want to pull out a few quotes from you. You said in page 51, you said, just because it's not rape doesn't mean it isn't dehumanizing, right? Yeah. And you said in the next page, I much prefer the infrequent mutual connection to frequent one-sided sexual encounters. This is a more emotionally fulfilling, more human way of relating. I really resonated with that because I've experienced that with my wife in those moments where she might have consented, right? She might have said, "Yeah, we'll go ahead. We'll do this because you want it." It was not fulfilling at all. Not fulfilling at all. So my question though is a one-sided sexual encounter dehumanizing in and of itself? Is it always dehumanizing? And is it always an expression of toxic masculinity? In other words, is it okay if she might want it, but I'm not necessarily in the mood, and vice versa?
Sure.
Does that necessarily make it toxic if it's, I'm not in the mood initially, but maybe things start heating up and I might get in the mood eventually, right? So
Precisely,
where do you draw that line?
Well, it's a great question, and I think every couple has to work this out for themselves, number one. Number two, I think be honest about yourself and the kind of sexual dynamics at play in your relationship, number one. And that can include asking hard questions about, is this really about connecting, or is this just about release? Am I treating my partner like a person or like an outlet? And I think you need to be really careful about this, but I do think there is a category for one partner initiating, obviously, and another partner, like, there's a difference between I absolutely do not want to have sex right now and like I don't want to have sex right now, but sure, those are different things.
Yep.
Or there's a big difference between I don't want to have sex right now, but because I am afraid of your emotional response, or I feel like it is my responsibility to take care of you, to like baby you in this way. Like I say, somewhere in the book, I say that I think sometimes men feel like their wife needs to like sexually babysit them every time they have an emotionally difficult day. And that to me is very unhealthy. And that's not what you want your sex life to be. And I think most men, like, you want to be intimate with someone who wants to be intimate with you. You don't just want to be like serviced. You actually want to be desired yourself.
Absolutely.
And these are, there are really careful issues of wisdom that need to be applied here. But to go every single time you engage intimately. Of course, that's great when that happens, and a lot of times people will look at those instances and be like, "Hey, that was really, really fun, and that was good, and we were connected, and that's great." But and there's a body of kind of psychological sex therapist literature to this effect that describes different types of sexual wiring. One that is, let's see if I get it right, spontaneous sexual desire, which we tend to associate with masculine sexuality, and then more responsive sexual desire that we tend to associate with female sexuality.
Okay.
But it's not to say that there aren't men who find their sexuality to be more responsive and women who find their sexuality to be more spontaneous.
Right.
That goes both ways, obviously. But it does give a category for exactly what you were describing, actually, where you can be like, all right, well, I'm not there, but I'm sure I can get warmed up and it'll be a really mutually fulfilling thing. Last thing I'll say on this is there needs to be a power and a dignity in the relationship where you can say, if you feel like you are being harmed or violated, or it's not working for you and this is no longer connecting and this is actually, I feel used or dehumanized in a certain way, or this is traumatizing me because of some past experience, something like that. There absolutely needs to be space to say stop.
Absolutely.
And knowing that will be respected immediately, and you will not be pressured and you will not be coerced into a sexual encounter that you are no longer consenting to.
Right.
So yeah, these are such good questions, and they're complex. They're not straightforward. And I think you're right to raise like, well, it's as simple as consent. Like, yeah, in one sense it is as simple as consent, but there are complex just relational dynamics even within a context of consent. I think actually marriage provides a great kind of foundation of consent for a sexual relationship, in the sense that you are committing to one another to have this be part of your relationship, that you will connect in this way in some regular frequency and serve each other in this way. But that service can never be one-sided in a way that reduces one person to a kind of subhuman status.
Absolutely. Good.
That's great. Now, you mentioned earlier, and you have a section of this in your book, about the idea of models of masculinity. And sometimes in our culture, we see sort of generic stereotypes about what a male is. We also see this often within Christian culture, some types of what males are. But can you walk us through some of these types of masculinity and models of it, and kind of explain what's helpful and unhelpful for our listeners to understand?
Yeah, I mean, I go after, and maybe this is what you're getting at in the question. Again, in an effort to raise questions. For Prince Charming as a kind of stereotype or a model of masculinity a little bit in the book, which is to say, I think a lot of people would identify the kind of knight in shining armor Prince Charming as the paragon of masculine virtue. And I think there's a lot, honestly, to celebrate in that kind of model where there's a certain type of courage and heroism and, at least on the surface, a honor and a respect for others and for women and for the poor and the oppressed and widows and things like that. That is part of kind of the Christian ethic that gets enfolded into medieval European chivalry, if you want to call it that. But I think there's a subtle twisting that can happen there where this kind of like violent heroism, where I go and kill the bad guy or kill the dragon, then entitles me to the romantic and perhaps even the sexual affections of the damsel in distress that I have rescued, quote unquote. Which downstream from this, I think there is just this subtle, perhaps, but I think it can develop into something really nefarious attitude of entitlement among men, where they see this model of masculinity where it's like, if I treat a woman in a kind, respectful, or even heroic way, she is meant to follow the script where she then gives me her romantic attention, or she owes me that attention, and she's like breaking the rules if she doesn't do that. That has moved into territory where this is no longer about just being courageous and helping others. It is about a certain type of sexual conquest. Right. And it has lessened her dignity, ironically, and denied her of agency. It's just a script. So yeah, that's one thing that comes to mind. Another one I think is just this kind of muscular macho model of masculinity that has sometimes been and continues to be celebrated in the church, where, again, I would just say this is baptized, whether they're Victorian England or kind of like Western frontier or mid-century Americana cultural categories. They're not necessarily kind of wholesale biblical in the way that they're often assumed to be. Not to say that there's anything wrong with, owning guns and going hunting, or owning a pickup truck, or weightlifting, or I don't even know, whatever you would associate with that type of masculinity model. Those aren't necessarily bad things. But the way they get kind of like packaged up, and to be a true man is to kind of indulge in this sort of dominant, physically intimidating, emotionally repressed, and especially assertive leader style model. That's one way of living out masculinity that perhaps can tend towards some vices, actually. But not every man needs to fit a single mold, I would say.
Oh, that's good. That's good. So, Zach Wagner, we so appreciated the conversation you've been willing to have with us this afternoon. And, I think your book offers a very nuanced perspective on a really difficult topic that, frankly, more people need to hear. And so I really appreciate your contribution to the wider Christian church, and I hope more people read it. The book is Non-Toxic Masculinity. And can you remind us, what is the subtitle of your book?
recovering healthy male sexuality.
Recovering healthy male sexuality. Great. And now you're more than just an author. So where else can people find you if they'd like to learn more about you and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. I have a personal website, ZacharyCWagner.com. And then on social media, you can find me, that same handle, Zachary C. Wagner, on Twitter. That's probably where I'm most active. I'm also on Instagram, ZWagner7.
Right.
And yeah, you can keep up with me there if you're interested.
All right. So Pastor Zach Wagner, thanks again for joining us to the Caffeinated Christian Podcast. And thank you, listener, for tuning in. We want you to know that you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at the Caffeinated Christian Podcast. That's at the Caffeinated Christian Podcast. And we want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and rate our podcast. That improves our visibility. Whether you give us 5 stars, whether you give us 1 star, like us or hate us, whatever, it's fine. Just give us a rating so people can find out about us. And if you ever want to reach out to us, please reach out to us on social media. And you can just reach out with a question, podcast ideas, episode ideas. We would love to hear from you. All right, guys, thanks so much. Until next time, have a great day.